It began with a birth that was never meant to happen, a cry in the night that carried more than life. It carried the weight of every lie buried by a family that believed silence could smother truth. Some children are born into hope, others into hardship, but he was born into a nightmare carefully constructed long before he took his first breath. And if you trace the roots far enough, if you follow the crooked lines of a lineage that tried to edit its own history, you'll discover that the real terror wasn't what he inherited, but what his family refused to let die. People say the past can't hurt you, but they say that because they've forgotten how powerful memory can be. They don't realize that secrets are not buried, they're seeded. And this story begins in a small, unremarkable American town where a single family ruled through respect on the surface and fear beneath it. A place where last names mattered more than honesty, where a handshake meant loyalty but not safety, and where everyone pretended not to hear what echoed through the walls of the old house on the hill. For 3 generations, the family hid something so old that even the elders spoke about it in half-sentences and unfinished thoughts. Something that stained photographs, warped recollections, and made every family gathering feel like a ritual rather than a reunion. They never said it outright, but their eyes told the story. Whatever happened in that house had shaped them all in ways they hoped the newest child would never have to understand. But families are not museums. They're organisms. They breathe, they bleed, and they pass down what they refuse to confront. And the boy born that cold November night grew up in the shadow of ancestors he never met, yet somehow felt. The way the floors creaked under his feet, the way conversation stopped when he entered the room, the way his mother held him too tight whenever he asked about the past. He learned early that his existence carried a weight he was too young to measure. He didn't know then that the truth had been waiting for him long before he could walk. He didn't know that he was the breaking point, the one the past had chosen to confront. And the cruelest part, he didn't even get a choice. The earliest memories of his life were fragments of unease. A lingering smell in the attic, the soft thud of doors closing where no one stood, whispers that seemed to chase him down the long hallway of the house. As a child, he thought it was normal, just the quirks of a family that liked to keep to themselves. But by the time he was old enough to notice the patterns, the hurried glances, the sudden silences, the way his father's hand shook when certain names were mentioned, he realized that what surrounded him wasn't just secrecy. It was something alive, something that had been cultivated across decades to protect a truth so twisted that most would rather forget it entirely. Every family has its heirlooms, its photographs, its diaries locked in drawers. But in his family, the heirlooms were warnings. Old journals written in careful script, filled with events described as if they had happened in another world. Sketches that seemed innocuous at first, lines and shapes, until you stare long enough to recognize patterns, symbols passed down like a hidden language, a language meant only for the initiated. And then there were the letters, sealed and marked with wax, written in code. They told stories of people disappearing, of doors closed forever, of debts owed to powers that no outsider would understand. And he found himself drawn to them, though every instinct screamed to run. School brought no reprieve. Other children laughed and played, oblivious to the invisible tension that clung to him like a second skin. He learned quickly to hide his curiosity, to nod along when questions about his family were asked, to smile when strangers remarked on how normal his life seemed. Normal was the word his family needed to use to survive. Behind closed doors, though, the truth waited. It seeped into his dreams, whispering in a voice both familiar and foreign, telling him that being born into this bloodline was not a blessing. It was a curse. By the time he reached his teens, small accidents were no longer dismissed as coincidence. The house seemed to respond to him. Doors creaking open to reveal objects moved, shadows that lingered too long, figures glimpsed in corners that vanished when confronted. The adults around him began to change subtly, almost imperceptibly, in tone and behavior, as if fearing that the child might somehow unlock what had been locked away for generations. The air grew heavier with every year, saturated with unspoken rules and invisible threats. And yet for all this, he was curious. He had to be, because the alternative, ignorance, was not a choice his bloodline allowed. They had been waiting for him to stumble, to confront what had been carefully hidden. They had built a world of whispers and locked rooms, and he had inherited it, whether he wanted it or not. The nightmare wasn't in the past. It was alive, and it had chosen him as its witness. The turning point came on a night that began like any other, but ended with the world he knew collapsing quietly around him. The house had always been alive with creaks and sighs, but that night the sounds carried a rhythm that made his skin crawl. It started with a letter slipped under his door, one he didn't recognize. The paper was aged brittle, the ink faded to brown. The words were brief, almost clinical. It begins with you. You cannot unsee, you cannot unhear, no signature, no explanation. Just a warning echoing a truth his family had never spoken aloud, and in that moment he understood. The nightmare wasn't waiting for him, it was already inside him. That night, he discovered the attic. The forbidden space his parents had always forbidden him to enter. He'd tiptoed past the warning signs, past the stacks of old crates and dust-covered furniture, and there it was, a chest, small but impossibly heavy, locked with an ornate keyhole carved in the shape of a symbol he would later learn had haunted the family for centuries. Something compelled him to open it. Curiosity, defiance, maybe a deeper instinctual pull. When the lock clicked open, he didn't find treasure, he found proof. Proof of a lineage built not on wealth or respect, but on survival of unspeakable acts, contracts with forces the outside world would call impossible, and a history of hiding children like him in plain sight, shaping them into the next link in a chain no one dared speak of. Inside the chest were letters, photographs, and objects, each one whispering secrets too dark to confront directly. There were images of ancestors whose faces seemed almost human, yet twisted by some internal horror. There were entries describing events that skirted the edges of madness, disappearances, rituals, forbidden knowledge passed down like currency, and amidst it all, a final note in a handwriting he recognized instantly. The handwriting of the first ancestor he would call grandfather. A message that seemed to reach across generations. Do not look away. You are the reckoning. He understood then that his life was never meant to be ordinary. Every lesson, every restraint, every odd tradition had been a preparation. He was the culmination of a bloodline trained to endure, to witness, and to survive horrors that were never spoken of outside these walls. And the weight of that revelation pressed on him, suffocating and relentless, because he was only beginning to grasp the full scope of what had been passed down. That night marked the end of childhood innocence. It marked the moment when he realized that the shadows of the past were not abstract, not stories for whispered conversations at family gatherings. They were alive, waiting patiently for him, shaping him, demanding he remember. And with that knowledge, he understood the terrible truth: the past is never really past, and some families are bound together not by love or loyalty, but by the burden of secrets too dark to survive exposure. The days that followed were a slow unraveling. He moved through the house with a new awareness, every glance and gesture from his parents now heavy with unspoken meaning. Rooms that had once felt familiar now seemed alien, as if the walls themselves were judging him for knowing too much. He began to notice patterns in behavior he had ignored before: the way his father avoided certain rooms at certain times, the way his mother paused mid-sentence as though listening to voices he couldn't hear. It was as if the entire household was a theater, and he had accidentally stepped off stage, seeing the machinery behind the illusion. He began to seek answers from relatives he had once trusted to keep him safe. But the further he reached into the past, the more he realized that the family's story had been carefully curated to hide a truth so grotesque that even the oldest members seemed afraid of it. Diaries were shredded, photographs were hidden, and family lore was reshaped to appear benign. The careful veneer of respectability had been constructed over decades, but he now saw the cracks: a painting that didn't belong, a misplaced heirloom, a name mentioned in passing that was deliberately erased from official records. At night, his dreams were no longer his own. They were a collage of faces, events, and memories that weren't his but somehow felt intimately familiar. He would wake drenched in sweat, heart racing, certain he had heard voices in the empty hallways of the house. Sometimes he could swear he felt hands on his shoulders, or a presence following him through the corridors, a weight that no one else could see. And in the daylight, he realized that his own reflection seemed to change his eyes, carrying a shadow that had been etched there long before his birth, inherited from ancestors whose deeds could not be spoken aloud. School and friends offered no refuge. He carried the burden alone, because how could he explain the reality of a family so steeped in secrecy that the world outside would never understand? Any attempt to share his experience was met with disbelief, or worse, polite dismissal. And yet, he couldn't stop. The knowledge clawed at him, demanding acknowledgement. And with every passing day, he understood that this was not just a personal curse. It was generational. Every secret, every act of concealment, had culminated in him, and now the past was pressing forward, seeking to complete what had been left unfinished. In the silence of the night, alone with the house breathing around him, he finally admitted the truth. He was not just a witness. He was part of the story, a continuation of a nightmare begun long before he existed. And the realization was almost worse than the secrets themselves, because now he knew he could never turn back. He had inherited the nightmare, and it would define the rest of his life. As he dug deeper, he began to uncover the mechanisms that had kept his family's nightmare alive for generations. It wasn't just secrecy or fear, it was a meticulously cultivated system of control. Every marriage, every relocation, every job was carefully orchestrated to preserve the family's isolation and its hidden knowledge. Ancestors had made choices that seemed ordinary to outsiders, buying property in certain towns, sending children to particular schools. But in reality, each decision was calculated to maintain the bloodline's survival, to shield it from prying eyes, and to ensure that the darkness remained buried, yet accessible to the next heir. He discovered coded diaries hidden in false bottoms of drawers, letters that referred cryptically to events that could not be spoken aloud, and photographs where faces were deliberately obscured. Each artifact was a piece of a puzzle too horrifying to assemble fully, yet impossible to ignore. And as he pieced these fragments together, he began to notice a pattern. The family's secrets were cyclical. Every generation had experienced a breaking point, an initiation into knowledge that no one else could understand, leaving a child scarred and silent, yet strangely empowered. He realized with chilling clarity that he was next in that cycle, destined to inherit not just the secrets but the responsibility for maintaining them. The psychological weight was immense. He began to recognize the subtle manipulations that had shaped his upbringing. A casual warning here, a deliberate omission there, and how every adult around him had played a role in preparing him for a truth they could never fully articulate. Sleep became elusive, the nights stretched long and oppressive, filled with the quiet echo of his ancestors' unresolved terror. And in the day, the world seemed sharper, more unforgiving, as though the house itself had imprinted a lens through which he now saw everything. Nothing was accidental, and every action carried consequence. By now, he was no longer a passive observer of his family's history. He was an active participant, forced into a role that had been written before he drew his first breath. Every conversation, every hidden artifact, every ritualistic detail, he had to understand, remember, and internalize them. And yet, the more he uncovered, the more he questioned, were the horrors of the past inherited, or had they been imposed? Was he cursed by lineage, or had the family's obsession with control created a self-fulfilling prophecy, one that trapped every child born into their house in the same spiral of dread? The answer was neither simple nor comforting. The darkness was real, yet it was also cultivated, nurtured by generations who refused to confront it. And now, standing at the threshold between revelation and madness, he realized that he had no choice but to continue, to descend fully into a history that no one was supposed to know, to face horrors that had been waiting patiently for him to arrive. Around this point in his journey, something inside him shifted. It wasn't courage. It wasn't clarity. It was something quieter and far more dangerous. Acceptance. Not acceptance of fate, but of responsibility, the understanding that someone in his bloodline was going to have to stop running. His ancestors had survived by burying the truth, but in doing so, they had fed it, strengthened it, given it room to grow into something monstrous and unmanageable. Now the past was no longer knocking. It was inside the house, inside their minds, inside him. And he knew that the only way forward was through the very darkness they feared. He returned to the attic, not because he wanted to, but because the weight of unfinished truth pulled him there like gravity. This time, he wasn't afraid. He brought the letters, the photographs, the coded messages, and laid them out, one by one, on the dusty wooden floor. The symbols that once resembled nonsense began to align. The names he had seen scratched out reappeared in other letters. Dates matched, places repeated. A pattern slowly emerged, not mystical, not supernatural, but disturbingly human. A legacy of wrongdoing disguised as tradition, traumas passed down like heirlooms. Rituals that were less about summoning forces and more about maintaining control through fear. As he read, he realized the nightmare wasn't the result of some ancient curse. No shadowy force had marked his family. The real darkness was the legacy of choices made by people who refused to face their own guilt. Generation after generation had hidden their worst acts beneath a shroud of mysticism, creating monsters out of memories and myths out of mistakes. The symbols, the coded letters, the rituals, they weren't the fingerprints of an otherworldly presence. They were the coping mechanisms of a family that couldn't bear the weight of its own actions. They had created a mythology dense enough to hide behind, hoping no one would ever peel it back and see the truth. And now he was staring at it, raw, unfiltered, undeniable. This realization shattered something in him. Not hope, not fear, but the illusion that he was powerless. This entire lineage, this entire nightmare, had been built on silence. His ancestors had weaponized secrecy, using it to manipulate each other, their children, and the world around them. They'd hidden abuse beneath tradition, violence beneath duty, and generational trauma beneath coded language. Every child born into the family had been raised inside a story designed to keep them compliant, frightened, and loyal. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight on his chest lighten. Not because the truth was less horrifying, but because it was finally visible. And if you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? With that revelation came a terrible clarity. He was not just a witness to the past. He was its heir. Every whispered warning, every frantic glance from his parents, every strange rule and hidden corner of the house had been designed to prepare him for this moment. The family had been waiting, across decades, for someone strong enough to face the truth without collapsing, yet fragile enough to carry it forward. And now the realization sat heavy on his shoulders. To survive, he would have to understand every horror, every secret, every lie, and live with them, fully conscious, for the rest of his life. He began to retrace the steps of those who came before him, piecing together events that had been deliberately obscured. Each discovery was a fracture in the veneer of normalcy. He found letters describing disappearances, legal documents altered or destroyed, photographs of relatives in unsettling postures or missing from group portraits entirely. Each artifact suggested something more, a methodical, deliberate shaping of reality itself. It was as if the family had been conducting an experiment across generations, shaping children, not to inherit wealth or reputation, but to inherit the unbearable truth of what they had done and what they were willing to do to survive. The house itself became both ally and adversary. Floors groaned under his footsteps like living things, doors refused to stay closed, and shadows lengthened unnaturally in corners he once considered safe. Objects would move overnight. The air carried a coldness that was impossible to explain, yet he sensed it was the accumulated weight of countless untold stories. And through it all, he began to recognize that he had inherited more than knowledge. He had inherited a responsibility, a mandate left unspoken by ancestors who could not bear to leave it in writing. The cycle could not be allowed to continue unchecked. Someone had to see it fully, understand it, and somehow survive it. The emotional toll was immense. Isolation became his companion. He could no longer trust casual conversation or small talk. The world outside seemed too superficial to contain the gravity of what he now knew. Every reflection in a mirror reminded him of the eyes that had come before him, eyes that had seen, suffered, and hidden. He realized that trauma was not just personal, it was genetic. His family's history had been passed down as more than stories. It had been encoded in their very behavior, in their instincts, in the weight of their silence. And now, it coursed through him as well, an invisible inheritance that demanded acknowledgement. Yet even as despair threatened to consume him, a strange form of resolve emerged. The nightmare, he understood, was not a chain designed to break him entirely. It was a test, a crucible, and he was standing inside it, fully aware, fully conscious, fully exposed. He had been born into secrecy, but now he had the power to confront it, and maybe, just maybe, to alter the course of a cycle that had endured for generations. He realized that confronting the family's legacy would require more than courage. It would demand cunning, patience, and a willingness to face horrors that most would flee from instinctively. The hidden histories weren't merely uncomfortable, they were corrosive. Each revelation threatened to unravel the fragile identity he had clung to show him the extent to which the family had manipulated, controlled, and, in some cases, destroyed lives to protect itself. And yet, he had no choice. To look away now would be to participate in the cycle, to allow the darkness to continue unchallenged. He began documenting everything he discovered, carefully cataloging letters, photographs, and coded entries. Each piece revealed both more of the past and more of the psychological architecture his family had built around it. Names reappeared in patterns, locations repeated across decades, and certain rituals, initially meaningless, revealed a disturbing logic. They weren't supernatural, not in the traditional sense. The terror was human, strategic, meticulous, and mercilessly adaptive. And he could trace it, step by step, through the lives of his ancestors, seeing how fear and secrecy had shaped every decision, every marriage, every move. The emotional impact was relentless. Nights were sleepless, days were heavy with unspoken dread, and every interaction with his parents, siblings, and relatives became a negotiation with the past itself. The knowledge he carried was infectious. The more he understood, the more it changed him. He felt their shadows on his shoulders constantly, a presence that refused to be denied. And yet, there was a paradoxical clarity in that weight. Unlike the distorted myths and legends that had surrounded his childhood, he could now see the mechanisms for what they truly were. And in that clarity, there was power. He also began to see the cracks in his family's control. Their careful planning, their obsession with secrecy, had left vulnerabilities. And as he pieced together the truth, he realized he had something they hadn't anticipated, insight unbound by fear. He could trace the lineage of manipulation, predict the strategies designed to maintain it, and begin to untangle the web. But he knew that every step carried risk. The family's obsession with control was not abstract. It was a living, breathing force. One misstep could trigger consequences that had been rehearsed for generations. Yet in that danger there was purpose. For the first time, he began to feel the possibility of liberation, not just for himself, but for the children yet unborn, for the descendants who would otherwise inherit the same nightmare. And even though the path forward was dark and the knowledge unbearable, he understood that the nightmare could not continue if he refused to participate silently. Confronting it was the only way to survive, and perhaps, finally, to end it. As he continued to explore the depths of the family's hidden history, he began to notice something chilling. The past seemed to anticipate him. Letters that had sat untouched for decades suddenly made sense in ways they never had. Symbols carved into furniture, which he once dismissed as decorative, revealed patterns only now visible to him. It was as if the family had left a trail, deliberately cryptic, but intended for someone, him, who would have both the curiosity and the endurance to follow it. The thought was terrifying. He realized that the nightmare had been waiting for him all along, shaping him even before he knew it existed. He began to uncover acts of cruelty disguised as discipline, disappearances rationalized as protection, and unspoken pacts that stretched across generations. Ancestors had buried trauma not to forget it, but to pass it on selectively, to mold children into carriers of knowledge too dangerous to be shared casually. Every revelation was a blow. He understood that his own upbringing had been engineered to produce someone capable of handling what the rest of the family could not. And yet, the design was imperfect, cracks remained, and he could see the fear in his elders, the anxiety that bubbled beneath their calm exteriors whenever certain names were mentioned or certain rooms were entered. The realization was both empowering and isolating. He had knowledge they could not suppress, insight into rituals and secrets that had been maintained for generations. But the price was high every day. He felt the weight of the past pressing against him, a constant reminder that the family's nightmare was not just history, it was inheritance. And as he pieced together the web of manipulation, betrayal, and control, he began to understand the psychological machinery that had allowed these horrors to persist. Fear was not the only tool. Obedience, loyalty, and love had all been weaponized, forged into chains that bound each generation tighter than the last. He could no longer speak freely, could no longer interact with the outside world without the awareness that the family's shadow followed him. The isolation was palpable. Friends, school, even casual conversations became exercises in self-preservation. Every word, every gesture carried the potential to unravel what had been carefully concealed for decades. And yet, there was also a growing resolve. He knew that acknowledging the full horror, naming it, understanding it, was the first step toward liberation. Even if liberation came at a cost that would haunt him forever. The house itself seemed to react. Floors groaned as if warning him, doors closed silently behind him as if to trap him, and shadows in corners held shapes that were almost human. It was alive in a way he could never have imagined, a repository for the collective memory of generations who had lived, suffered, and died under the weight of the same hidden truths. And in that oppressive presence, he realized that he was no longer a child. He was the heir. And the nightmare that had been waiting for generations was finally awake. He began to understand that the nightmare wasn't simply a collection of horrors from the past. It was a living, breathing architecture of the family itself. Every secret, every whispered warning, every act of concealment had been carefully constructed to survive time, to pass from parent to child like a dark inheritance. And now he was the link in that chain. The realization was suffocating. He was not only witnessing history, he was part of it. Every thought, every choice, every moment of fear he experienced now had a place in a lineage that stretched back generations, and the full weight of that truth pressed on him relentlessly. He began mapping the family's history in painstaking detail, tracing patterns of behavior, recurring tragedies, and decisions made in fear. Names reappeared across generations attached to events that were eerily similar. Disappearances, sudden illnesses, and inexplicable accidents. He began to see the family's hidden philosophy. The world was dangerous and knowledge was power, but only when wielded with discretion. And discretion had been maintained through terror, through silence, and through the careful grooming of children to inherit knowledge they could neither fully share nor forget. The psychological toll was relentless. He felt as if he were living multiple lifetimes at once. His own, and the echoing memories of every ancestor who had endured the same fear, the same isolation, and the same responsibility. Sleep became a battleground. Dreams were no longer restful but replayed scenes of past horrors, sometimes blending them with his own life in ways that made it difficult to distinguish past from present. And in waking hours, the house itself seemed aware of his progress, reacting to his presence with creaks, drafts, and shadows that suggested more than simple architecture. Yet amidst the terror, a strange form of clarity emerged. The family's power had always relied on its secrecy. Its control was strongest when knowledge was fragmented, when fear operated without understanding. But now, with every revelation, he began to strip away the illusions that had protected the family's hidden truths for generations. He could see the mechanisms, the strategies, the rituals, all designed to manipulate, isolate, and dominate. And in seeing them clearly, he felt a dangerous, exhilarating sense of possibility that he might be able to break the cycle, to confront what had been inherited and decide for himself how to live with it. He understood, finally, that the nightmare had been waiting for him, and only him. And as he stared into the shadows of the house, listening to the echoes of ancestors who had long since passed, he realized that survival would require more than endurance. It would require courage, cunning, and the willingness to face truths that had destroyed those before him. The family's secrets were no longer abstract, they were alive, pressing against him, challenging him, daring him to become the first in generations to see them fully and survive.